Something got into my truck that night, and I didn't notice it at first. When I did, it was already sitting behind me.
Story 1. I was driving alone on Route 66 at 3:42 in the morning when I saw him standing under the only working light at a dead gas station near kilometer 17. I had been on the road for hours. No cars, no houses, no signs of life, just the engine, the trailer, and the sound of the tires moving over broken asphalt. The station appeared on the right side of the road without warning. One pump island, one cracked sign, one low building with black windows, and one fluorescent tube above the pumps, flashing in an uneven rhythm. The gauge was low. There would not be another stop. I pulled in, turned off the engine, opened the door, and stepped down onto the concrete. The noise from the truck stopped at once. The only sound left was the fluorescent light and the metal click of the engine cooling. He was already there. He stood just outside the circle of light, tall, thin, wearing a black coat that extended below his knees and a dark hat pulled low enough to hide most of his face. The sleeves covered his hands. The coat did not move. He did not shift his weight. He did not react to the sound of the truck or the door. I stopped. My hand remained on the side of the truck. He turned his head slowly until he faced me. "You heading toward Los Barros?" The voice came out in two tones at the same time, one low and one high. I looked around the station. No attendant. No parked vehicles. No movement in the building. No sound except the light above us. I did not leave. I opened the passenger door. He walked toward the truck. There were no footsteps on the concrete. No gravel movement. No sound from the coat. He climbed in. The seat did not drop. The suspension did not react. I got back behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove out to the road again. I kept my eyes forward for the first minutes. The headlights showed the center line, the shoulder, the dry brush, and nothing else. When I checked the mirror, the passenger seat looked empty. I looked at it directly. He was sitting there, facing forward, the hat still low over his face. I looked back at the mirror. The seat was visible. The road behind us was visible. He was not in the reflection. I drove another mile before I asked where he was from. He waited several seconds before answering. The last one called me the passenger. He turned his head toward me. That was before he lost his eyes. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road. The engine began to vibrate through the steering wheel. The dashboard lights dimmed once, then steadied. I pressed the gas pedal. The truck did not increase speed. I checked the gauges. They dropped together, then rose together, then stopped. I looked at the passenger seat. It was empty. The door was closed. I checked the mirror again. He was in the back seat, leaning forward between the two front headrests. The hat was gone. The skin over his eyes was closed and stitched with thick black thread. The thread crossed over itself and disappeared near the temples. His mouth opened slightly. The teeth were visible. Almost there. The truck stopped. The engine cut off. The dashboard went black. There were no hazard lights. I turned the key. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. I looked through the windshield. The road ended. The white line was gone. The shoulder was gone. The headlights reached darkness and stopped. I checked the mirror again. He was closer. His face filled most of the glass. The thread across his eyes moved once, pulling tighter from left to right. I opened the door and stepped down onto the road. The air outside was cold and still. There was a smell of old fuel and damp fabric. I turned back toward the truck. The front seat was empty. The back seat was empty. Every door was closed. The engine started by itself. The headlights came on. The truck began to roll forward. I moved away from the lane as it passed me without a driver. The trailer followed in a straight line. The red lights at the back became smaller and then disappeared. I stood on the road and listened. No engine, no wind, No movement. I turned back toward the gas station. The light above the pumps was gone. The building was gone. There was no station, no concrete, no sign, only open dirt and low brush beside the road. I walked to the place where the truck had stopped. The tire marks ended in the middle of the asphalt. They did not continue forward. I looked down at my sleeve. Something touched the fabric. A thin black thread was attached near the wrist. I grabbed it with 2 fingers and pulled. It tightened and slid across the cloth toward my skin. I pulled harder. It did not break. It cut inward against the sleeve and moved onto my arm. I let go and stepped back. The thread kept moving, slow and straight, climbing toward my elbow. I began to move away from the road. My steps increased. I stayed on the asphalt and continued forward without turning around. When daylight appeared, I reached the next town. I entered a motel room, locked the door, and checked my arm in the mirror. The thread was gone. There was no mark. Later that morning, I reported the truck. It was found near kilometer 17, with the doors closed and the engine cold. No damage. No record of a second person inside the vehicle. I asked to see it. The request was denied. One of them said there was something on the back seat that was not present before. That night, inside the room, I heard a sound. It was low and continuous. It came from behind me. I remained still. The sound stopped. Then it came again, closer to the bed. I stood and looked. The curtain was still. The window was locked. There was nothing on the floor. I turned toward the chair by the desk. A black coat was folded over the backrest. The sleeves hung down. A loose black thread extended from one cuff. It moved once and then stopped. I went to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. No one was there. No footsteps. No voices. I left the room open and walked to the front desk. The clerk came upstairs with me. The room was empty. The chair stood against the desk. No coat, no thread. I took another room across the hall. Before I left, I checked under the bed, inside the closet, behind the curtain, and in the bathroom. Nothing. The second room was smaller. I locked the door and stayed awake. At 5:46, I heard the voice again from the hallway side of the wall. 2 tones at the same time, one low and one high. You are still on the route. I opened the door at once. The hallway was empty. On the carpet, directly in front of my room, there was a single thin black thread stretched in a straight line toward the stairwell. I followed it to the landing. It ended at the glass exit door. Outside, in the parking lot, my truck was parked under the only lamp. The engine was off. The headlights were off. Through the windshield, someone was sitting in the back seat, leaning forward, facing the building. Story 2. I was inside the house at 11:13 at night when the lights in the hallway turned off without any sound, and the only light left came from the television in the living room behind me, casting a weak reflection across the floor and up the wall in front of me. I had locked every door before going to bed. I checked them twice. The front door was secured. The back door was secured. The windows were closed. The curtains were drawn. There was no movement outside when I looked earlier. I was standing near the kitchen entrance when the hallway went dark. The bulb did not flicker. It did not dim. It turned off completely. I looked at the switch on the wall. It was still in the same position. I did not touch it. I stepped forward and stopped at the edge of the hallway. The air felt colder there. The floorboards did not make any sound when I shifted my weight. I waited. Nothing moved. Then I heard it. A sound from deeper inside the house. A soft, dragging noise, slow and steady, coming from the direction of the back room. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It repeated at the same interval, moving slightly closer each time. I stood still and listened. The sound stopped. Then it came again, one step closer. I reached for my phone and turned on the light. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow line. The hallway walls appeared flat and empty. The door to the back room was closed. The handle did not move. I walked forward slowly, keeping the light steady. The sound did not return while I moved. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle. It was cold. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room inside was empty. The bed was in place. The chair was in place. The window was closed. The curtains did not move. There was no one inside. I stepped in and turned in a full circle. Nothing changed. Then I heard it again, not from the room, from the hallway behind me. I turned back toward the door. The hallway light was still off. The darkness remained the same. I stepped out of the room and into the hallway again. The sound stopped. I walked toward the living room. The television was still on. The image had changed to static. There was no audio. The screen flickered without sound. I stood there for several seconds. Then the volume increased by itself. A low hiss filled the room. Under it, there was something else. A voice. Not clear, not complete. Just fragments of sound repeating under the static. I stepped closer. The screen showed no image except the noise pattern. The voice continued. It repeated the same pattern again and again. I turned the volume down. It did not respond. The sound remained at the same level. I unplugged the television. The screen went black. The sound stopped. The room was silent again. I turned toward the hallway. The light turned on by itself. No flicker, no delay, just on. The switch did not move. I walked back toward the hallway. The air felt colder again. The dragging sound returned. This time, it came from above me, from the ceiling, directly over the hallway. I looked up. The ceiling was flat, no opening, no movement. The sound moved across the ceiling, from one end of the hallway to the other. Then it stopped above the living room. I stepped back. The sound stopped completely. I stood there and did not move. Then I heard a different sound, a short knock, one time, from the front door. I turned toward it. The lock was still engaged. The handle did not move. I approached slowly. I stood in front of the door and waited. There was no second knock. I looked through the peephole. The outside was empty. The porch light was on. No one stood there. I stepped back from the door. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, behind me, inside the house. I turned. The hallway was empty. The light was still on. The floor was clear. The sound continued. It moved along the wall this time. Not the floor, not the ceiling. It moved at the height of the door handles, slow and steady, stopping at each doorway before continuing forward. I followed it with my eyes as it reached the kitchen entrance and stopped there. Then it ended. I walked toward the kitchen. The light inside was still off. I reached for the switch and turned it on. The room appeared normal. The table was in place. The chairs were in place. The sink was empty. Nothing moved. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. I stopped near the center of the room. Then I heard the voice, close, not from the television, not from outside. From inside the room, behind me. You locked the doors. The voice came out in two tones at the same time, one low, one high. I turned immediately. The doorway was empty. The hallway light remained on. There was no one there. I stepped backward slowly. The voice came again, but I was already inside. The kitchen light turned off. The room went dark. I moved toward the doorway and into the hallway. The light there remained on. I turned back toward the kitchen. The darkness inside did not change. I stood there and did not move. Then something appeared at the edge of the doorway. Not fully visible, just part of a shape, a shoulder, a sleeve, black fabric. It did not move forward. It did not step out. It remained exactly at the edge, where the light from the hallway stopped. I watched it. The shape did not change. Then the hallway light turned off again. The house went completely dark. No sound. No movement. I reached for my phone again and turned on the light. The beam moved across the doorway. The kitchen was empty. The shape was gone. I stepped backward toward the front door. I unlocked it, opened it, and stepped outside. The air outside was still. The street was empty. No cars, no people. I turned back toward the house. The lights inside were on again. Every room visible from the outside was lit. The hallway, the kitchen, the back room, all of them. I stood on the porch and did not move. Then I saw it, a figure standing inside the hallway. Facing the door, tall, thin, wearing a black coat. The face was not visible. It did not move. It did not approach. It stood there under the light, waiting. I closed the door slowly, without taking my eyes off it. The lock clicked into place. I stepped back from the door. From the other side, I heard a single sound, a slow drag across the floor. Then, nothing. Story 3. I was in seat 22 of Carriage 5 on the night train, 1:57, when the doors closed at 11:45 and the train began to move without any announcement. The platform outside, still visible through the window. People standing still as the carriage slid past them. And I checked my ticket again to confirm the route. Madrid to Barcelona. Departure correct. Seat correct. Carriage correct. And I placed the ticket back in my pocket, while the lights inside the carriage flickered once as we entered the first tunnel, then stabilized again, revealing a half-empty space, a few passengers scattered. None speaking, none looking at each other, and I sat facing forward with my bag under the seat and a book open in my hands. And after several minutes, I heard a sound in the aisle, not footsteps, something slower, dragging along the floor at a steady pace. And I lifted my head and saw a man walking toward me from the far end of the carriage, tall, thin, wearing a long black coat and a dark hat that covered most of his face. His movements smooth, but without any sound from the floor beneath him. And as he reached my row, he stopped beside my seat and turned his head toward me without lifting it fully. "Excuse me, have you seen a child here?" And the voice came out in two tones at the same time. One low, one high, aligned but not identical. And I shook my head without speaking, and he remained there for a moment before speaking again. "He carries a wooden train," and I repeated the same answer. "No." And then he leaned slightly closer, the hat still covering his face. "He says you have seen him." And then he straightened again and continued down the aisle without waiting for a response, moving toward the next carriage door. And I watched him until he reached it. And when the door opened, there was no sound, no mechanism. It slid aside and closed again after he passed through. And I looked around the carriage. No one reacted. No one turned. No one spoke. And I looked back down at my book, but the text did not change. And I closed it and reached for my bag to check inside. And when I opened it, there was something I had not placed there. A small wooden train, old, worn, the paint faded. And I lifted it out and placed it on the table in front of me. And each small carriage of the toy had a shape inside, figures made from thin black threads. twisted together into human forms, and I did not move for several seconds. Then I placed the toy back into the bag and closed it, and the lights flickered again as the train entered another tunnel, longer this time, and when the lights returned, the carriage appeared the same, except one seat at the far end was now occupied by a child, small, sitting upright, holding a similar wooden train in both hands. And the child looked directly at me without blinking, and I remained in my seat without moving, and after a few seconds the child spoke. She, "Do you want to play?" And the voice came out distant, even though the distance between us had not changed, and I did not answer, and I stood up and stepped into the aisle. And as I turned toward the door, the length of the carriage extended, the far end moving further away, the rows of seats repeating in the same pattern, the door no longer at the same distance as before. And I stopped and looked back, the child still seated, still watching, still holding the train, and I turned forward again and walked toward the next carriage. And the door opened without sound as I approached, and I stepped through into carriage 6, and then 7, and then 8, and each carriage was empty, lights steady, no passengers, no sound. And when I entered carriage 8, there was a table in the center with a glass and a bottle placed on it, and no one around, and I stepped closer and looked down at the glass, the liquid inside still. And when I raised my head, the child was sitting on the opposite side of the table, the wooden train placed between us, and I stepped back immediately, and the chair behind me did not move. And when I turned toward the aisle, the carriage had changed again, the length extended, the doors along the side all visible at once, each one open except one at the far end, a single door closed, marked with a sign that read, "Out of service," the letters uneven, dark, and I moved toward it. And as I approached, I heard something from behind the door, a sound of multiple voices, overlapping, low, repeating, and among them the same two-tone voice I had heard before. And I stopped directly in front of the door and looked at the handle. It did not move, and from inside, the voice spoke clearly. "The train has already departed." And then another voice, the same tone. "And you did not leave." And I stepped back and turned away from the door and moved quickly toward the previous carriage. But the path did not shorten. The distance remained the same, the rows repeating. And I continued moving until I reached the next door and stepped through, and the carriage changed again, now first class, wider seats, worn leather, curtains hanging from the windows. And one passenger seated near the window, an older woman, looking outside, not moving. And I crossed the aisle and looked out through the glass, and outside there was a platform, no lights, no signs, no movement, and a figure standing on the platform, a child facing the train. And the woman spoke without turning, "That is my daughter." And I looked at her, and then back at the window, and the reflection in the glass showed only the interior of the carriage, the woman seated, me standing, but not the child outside. And I stepped away from the window and moved toward the next door. And when I opened it, I entered a carriage that did not match the others. The walls covered in thin black threads stretched from one side to the other. Crossing over the windows, the seats replaced by old wooden chairs arranged in rows, and in the center of the floor the child sat with the wooden train, and along the seats there were figures sitting upright, unmoving, their heads facing forward, and at the far end of the carriage, the man in the black coat sat in a seat, his hands moving slowly, pulling thin threads between his fingers, forming shapes that extended across the walls and ceiling. And I stopped at the entrance and did not move, and the child looked up from the train and then toward the man, and the man spoke without lifting his head. "You found your place," and I remained where I was, and the train slowed suddenly, the movement of the carriage shifting forward, the lights flickering once and then going out completely. Ma. And when they returned, the carriage was empty. No figures, no child, no man. Only the wooden train on the floor in the center of the aisle. And I stepped forward and looked down at it. And one of the small figures inside had been added, a new shape made of black thread, positioned at the end of the last carriage, and I did not touch it, and I turned toward the door behind me. And when I stepped through, I was back in carriage 5, my original seat visible, my bag still under it, the lights steady, the carriage half empty again, and no one looking at me. And I sat down slowly and did not move. And when the train arrived at Barcelona, the doors opened and passengers began to leave, and I remained in my seat until the carriage was empty. And when I stood and reached for my bag, it felt heavier. And when I opened it, the wooden train was inside again, placed exactly in the center. And one of the figures inside had my shape. And as I looked at it, I heard the voice again, close, from behind me, 2 tones at once. Next stop. And when I turned, there was no one there. But in the reflection of the window, I was no longer alone in the seat. And behind me, leaning forward, there was someone sitting, facing me, waiting for the train to move again. If you made it this far, then you already understand something most people don't. Some places are not meant to be found, and some journeys don't end when you arrive. So tell me in the comments, which one stayed with you the most? The road that never lets you leave, or the train that never lets you arrive? And be honest, have you ever been somewhere that didn't feel right, but you stayed anyway? If you enjoy stories like these, subscribe to Tales of the Darkness and turn on notifications, because the next story might feel a little too familiar. Sleep well. Tonight,